Welcome to now the 11th session of the Faith and Science Common Core course. Today we're going to be looking at how we get information, how we find things out about the world around us. So last lecture we looked at, once we've got information, assuming we can get it from somewhere, how do we put that information together? And we said, okay, you can either take obvious bits of information and logically build them up to get your conclusion, or you can take all sorts of bits of information which are not necessarily obvious within themselves, and you can link them together in various ways which are then coherent. And this entire discussion, whichever one of those foundationalism or coherentism we take, this entire discussion assumed that we could get information. So today we're going to look at how we get information. And the ways of getting information we are going to consider are three: specifically reason, observation, and faith. So reason kind of seems sensible. I think about it, I rationalize, I do the maths, and I get the answer. Fine. Observation seems a sensible way of getting information. We look and it's there in front of us. I found something out about the universe. Faith seems an odd way of getting information. So let's look for a second. Let's start there, because this is the one that may be puzzling. So let's start there. Now, Merriam-Webster says that faith is a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. This doesn't sound like a way of getting information. This sounds like a lack of information. This sounds like when you don't have enough information to demonstrate what you want to believe, you just believe it anyway. So it seems strange to list faith as a way of getting information about the universe. But before we throw it out too rapidly, let's put up what the writer to the Hebrews said in the Bible. He said, faith is the evidence of things not seen. Now, how do we get such two radically different definitions between Merriam-Webster, who says that faith is a lack of evidence, and the writer to the Hebrews, who says that faith is evidence? If faith was evidence, that would seem that it then would be a source of information about the world. So in order to understand how we get to such radically different definitions, we need to go back to the Enlightenment. Specifically, we need to go back to David Hume. So Hume had this thing called Hume's fork. In his inquiry concerning human understanding, he said, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school of metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion. So Hume has two ways of getting information about the world. Okay, we can know things by reason, which is to say abstract reasoning in Hume's terminology, or we can know it by observation, which is to say experimental reasoning in Hume's terminology. Okay, in science we have theorists who know by reason, and we have experimentalists who know by observation. And we can see these ways of getting information, they come through in language. A conclusion can be reasonable, which is to say attained by reason, or it can be sensible, which is to say attained by the senses. Now, reason tells us that which is necessarily true. Triangles have three sides. 1 + 1 = 2. Observation tells us that which is contingently true. I am in Hong Kong. The universe could be otherwise. I might not be in Hong Kong, but I am. I know that by observation. The universe could not be otherwise. Triangles have three sides, and so I know that by reason. And things which are necessarily true and things which are not necessarily true, that covers everything you want to know, right? There is no other hidden third category of thing we want to find out, right? So there's nothing else to be known, and there are no other ways of knowing it. So says Hume. Now, faith, on this picture, we have a couple of options. Either faith has its roots somewhere in reason, or faith has its roots somewhere in observation, or faith has its roots somewhere in a mixture between the two, or faith is not and cannot be a source of knowledge. So either faith is reducible to observation and reason, or faith cannot provide you with knowledge. So far, so good. Now we can understand Merriam-Webster's definition. Here is what they say. They say that if we had proof, which is to say reasoned evidence or observational evidence, then we'd have knowledge. Now, if we had knowledge, we'd just call it knowledge. We wouldn't need some separate word for faith. Now, given that we do have this separate word for faith, and there's no point in just making it a synonym for knowledge because it's clearly something else, we'll have to call it not knowledge. Now, not knowledge is stuff for which we don't have proof, for which there either isn't reasoned evidence or observational evidence. This makes sense. We've now kind of covered our bases. We've got things that we know and things that we don't know. And things that we know by reason and observation, and things that we don't know by reason and observation. And this stuff is faith. This view of Merriam-Webster makes sense if you agree with Hume. Now, this is important. The writer of Hebrews did not agree with Hume. They could come up with a different idea, exactly because they were convinced that Hume was wrong. So let's first consider some examples playing with reason and observation. There are some things which I know by reason and which I can only know by reason. Let's say, for example, that there are infinitely many integers, which is to say, if I start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I can keep going and I never run out of numbers. Now, reason tells me that is the case. Mathematicians are quite happy with this notion, but observation cannot tell me that is the case, because even if I don't run out of numbers, I run out of breaths, I run out of time in the universe. I can't ever count infinitely high. So observation doesn't tell me that, cannot tell me that, but reason can. On the other hand, if I say putting my hand in a candle flame hurts, reason cannot tell me that. Reason can do all sorts of wonderful things, but it cannot tell me about the qualia of pain. And yet observation, it takes the briefest of observation of putting your hand in a candle flame to realize that flames hurt. So this we can learn by observation, but not by reason. If I say 1 + 1 = 2, I can know that by reason. I can sit down, set theoretically, and I can demonstrate that it is a fact that 1 + 1 = 2. Alternatively, I can take an apple and I can take another apple and I can count them 1, 2, and I can see that I have 2 apples. So this I can demonstrate by reason or by observation. Now, if I'm in a lab and someone says, oh, at low temperatures, this wire has 0 resistance. Now, there's nothing in reason alone which will tell me that. I can't do the maths without any observation. I need to know what kind of wire. I need to know what kind of temperature. I need to have some experimental details about this. But there's also nothing in the observation alone which will tell me that, because while I can see 1 apple and 1 apple, I can't see 0 resistance. I need to have a voltmeter, and I can see that my voltmeter says whatever it says, but I can't see the resistance. I need to have some reasoning steps in the chain to get from what I observe to this other idea over here, which is a little bit abstracted. So something like this wire has 0 resistance at low temperature, I can know by a combination of observation and reason. Now, So we have things that we can know by reason, things that we can know by observation, things that we can know by reason or observation, things that we need to know by both reason and observation. Fine. But what happens? Which one's better? Which one's king of finding things out? What happens when observation and reason disagree? It could be the case that they don't agree with each other. Theorists and experimentalists do not always come to the same conclusions. If they did, we could just fire all the theorists or fire all the experimentalists because it's cheaper to employ theorists. Right? They don't come to the same conclusion. So in a dispute between theorists and experimentalists, who wins? And the answer is, it depends. If my student comes to me and says, I've made an observation, this wire has zero resistance at low temperature. And I say, well, reason says that's deeply unlikely. Go away and do it again. Right? In that sense, reason wins. I don't have to make the observation. I know he's almost certainly wrong because that wire is made of chewing gum, and chewing gum almost certainly isn't superconducting in ice water. Right? He's probably made a mistake. Reason tells me that. But if my student goes away and makes this measurement repeatedly and tests it and checks it and so on and so forth, even if I don't have a reasoned answer as to why it should be the case, he might ultimately convince me and I go, yeah, all right, I don't know why, but I'm going to accept the observation. So sometimes reason trumps observation, and sometimes observation trumps reason. So we've got here these two categories which are wonderfully independent, right? This one, reason, isn't a form of observation. It's not reducible to observation. And observation isn't a form of reason and reducible to reason. And reason doesn't always trump observation, and observation doesn't always trump reason, right? It's this messy, argumentative interplay of the two. And Hume was okay with this. Hume was quite okay with this. So now we ask ourselves the question, you know, it would be nice if we just had one, right? This is the way we find information, and it's that or it's nothing. But we don't have one. We have at least two. And so now we can ask the question, if we have two, why not three? Why not 17? So is there some other way to get at information of the world? For example, hypothetically speaking, if there were some transcendent divine power with his fingers on the control switches of the universe, if he was able to place knowledge supernaturally in your head without the information having to go through your eyeballs, or without the information having to be done by a connecting of your synapses in a logical fashion, if he just went, right, there you go, now you know the answer, would that be a way of getting information about the universe? God told you, God put it in your head? Well, potentially, hypothetically speaking, yes. So this then gives us three ways of knowing. Rationality gives us knowledge by reason. The senses give us knowledge by observation. And revelation gives us knowledge by faith. Now, this is the view that the writer of the Hebrews had. This is the view which extended through large chunks of European thought. And it was in the Enlightenment, when people decided to do away with God, that this idea that revelation could be a source of knowledge was removed from this list. And the reason it was removed from this list was, you said, is there a way that a transcendent being could reach into your brain and provide revelation to you? And the answer was no, because there is no transcendent being. Well, if we've assumed a priori that there is no God, then obviously God cannot provide revelation to you. But we can't then say, aha, and now there's no evidence for God in reason and there's no evidence for God in observation, therefore there is no God, because those are the only ways to know things, because you've just started from the beginning of saying there is no God, therefore these are the only ways to know things. We've come up with a circular or consistent argument. So a coherentist may be happy with this, but we have to recognize that this is a deeply circular argument that the Enlightenment pulled. So now we can understand what this distinction happens between Merriam-Webster and the writer to the Hebrews. Because if God told me something, then I know it. Now, if you say to me, you know, where are your keys? And I say, my keys are on the cabinet next to my front door. And you say, how do you know that? Have you seen them? I say, no, I left the house without them. I couldn't find them. But then my wife phoned me and told me. Okay. So how do you know? My wife told me. Okay. This looks a bit like revelation. Now, it's not quite revelation because, in fact, when I say my wife told me, this is traceable to my senses. I experience my wife telling me through my ears. Therefore, this is actually observation, not direct observation of the keys, but observation of hearing my wife, coupled with the reason of saying my wife tends to be an honest person who has no reason to lie to me about my keys. So this combination of observation and reason says, my wife told me my keys are on the side, therefore I know that my keys are on the side. Now, if God can reach into your brain and plant the information in your brain without it having first gone through your ears or through your senses, then this is an independent source of information. But God can still tell you, independent of reason and observation, and that could count as knowledge. How do you know that God loves you? God told me. So faith, knowledge by revelation, is the evidence of things not seen. I haven't seen God loving me. He didn't come down and with big arms and hug me. I haven't seen him loving me, and yet I know it because he told me. And that telling is the evidence of the thing which I haven't seen. Now, there are some who would say, aha, we have twolistism. Look at this. Science, we've already established, does reason and observation, and religion does faith. Twolistism, and science has more things in its list. It's got reason and observation, and religion has faith. But you can guess by now, we're not going to run into the arms of twolistism. Let's ask, could reason have a place in religion? And the answer is a very simple yes, right? We can move it. Reason isn't just in the science column, right? Reason hangs on to religion as well. To take a Christian example, the prophet Isaiah gives the words of God speaking to the tribe of Judah. God says to Judah, come, let us reason together. God himself, talking patiently to a wayward child, says, look, let's sit down and work this out. Don't just take my word for it. It just makes sense. So there is a place in religion for reason. Does observation have a place in religion? Yes, it does. Proverbs 6, to take another biblical example, says, go to the ant, you sluggard, observe her ways and be wise. We can know something about working hard. We can know something about diligence and so on and so forth by looking at the universe. Observation has a place in religion. We don't have to wait for God to tell us what an ant is like. He's given us an ant and he's given us eyeballs and he says, you go do the footwork. So certainly observation and reason have a place in religion. Now, can faith have a place in science? And by faith here, I mean faith as a way of obtaining information about the universe. So, in order to answer that, before we jump into anything that looks too religion-y, let's look at why we accept anything in science. Why do we accept maths, for example, right? Reason, why do we accept reason as having any place in science whatsoever? Now, Eugene Wigner pointed out in a famous paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics, he said that the fact that maths works is surprising. It works a lot better than we might expect. It does, or should. Mathematicians can go away and they can come up with all sorts of weird and crazy ideas. And a lot of them seem to apply to the universe. Now, some of them don't. you can use integers for counting. We don't tend to use irrational numbers for counting. Mathematicians make this nice thing, but you don't have an irrational number of apples. You never have an irrational number of apples. But still, maths, while it doesn't need to work in the universe, it usually does work in the universe, and that is surprising. So why do we accept maths as having a place in science? And the answer is, it works. Do we know why it works? No. Do we care that we don't know why it works? No. That's a problem for philosophers, not a problem for scientists. Do theoreticians always get it right? No. Do they get it right sufficiently often that it's worth keeping them around? Yes. Right. Sometimes they go off on a crazy one and they develop M theory, and we can argue over whether that's worth funding or not, and I have opinions on that. But never mind. But for a lot of things, theoreticians, when they say, you know, you could just try a whole pile of measurements and just measure everything you can and spend vast sums of money just measuring blindly, or a theoretician can say, I think measure here, just that bit there. Don't worry about the rest. That one's going to be interesting. And sometimes they're wrong. You measure there and nothing interesting happens at all. But sometimes they're right. And they're right often enough that we say, please keep funding this theoretician. Okay, this is how science works. We don't know why maths works, and we don't care that we don't know why maths works. As long as it keeps working often enough to be useful, we keep them around. Now, is everyone good at maths? No. Some people, I mean, have their brains just cannot do maths. They have, you know, acalculia, and they just cannot get their head around maths. Some people can kind of get at the basic grasp of maths, but they're not really good at it. So what we do is we find people who can do it and we train them to do it more. We give them a better intuition and a better understanding and a better foundation and a better toolkit for being able to do maths. And when a mathematician comes to you and says, if I integrate this, then you're going to get the right answer, you don't go, I don't understand how you got there. You just go, thank you very much. Now, this is what religious communities do as well with faith. Some people show a sensitivity to revelation. Some people, they just walk through the world completely blind and wouldn't know God if it slapped them in the face. Whereas, and different religious communities, Christians and Buddhists and Baha'i and Taoists, they have different ways of working this out. But all religious communities have within them people who are recognized as being sensitive to revelation. Maybe that comes through prayer. Maybe that comes through mushrooms. But we take this sensitivity and we train them in it, just like we train mathematicians. And we find they may not always get it right, but they get it right often enough that we deem it worthwhile keeping them around. So, and when they say, this is what we need to do, you look at it and you go, it's all maths to me, right? But you don't need to be able to follow the reasoning of how they got there any more than I need to be able to follow higher calculus to know to point my laser here. I go, I'm going to take that answer and I'm going to see if it works. So this is what people do in religion. Is that necessarily out of place in science? Well, let's take two examples. So one is George Washington Carver. Each morning, he would wake before dawn and he would go into the woods and he would pray. And he would ask God what God wanted him to do that day. And God would tell him all sorts of interesting things to do. Go and crush this peanut. Go and plant this plant there in this kind of soil with that kind of water, with that kind of sunlight. And George Washington Carver would go and do that. And interestingly, not all of his experiments worked, but they worked sufficiently often that he became famous for doing all sorts of interesting things with peanuts and plants and botany. So he said, a person is at liberty to experiment with anything he can. Our eyes and ears are always open and we must be patient and wait. So this sounds like a scientist, right? We're going to do experiments and we need to make these observations. Our eyes and ears have to be open. just as the prophets of old. Isaiah and the old prophets always had their eyes and ears open. Listening, they heard a voice. God speaks to you through the things he created. That's what he was doing while I was developing all these things from the peanut. He was telling me I could do what I've done, and I was interpreting for the Lord. George Washington Carver, in a sense, was a prophet. He obtained information from God and he interpreted for the world, or he believed certainly that he was obtaining information from God, and he interpreted for the world what that was. And he went out and he used this to inspire the particular science experiments that he was doing. Now, if you say, well, science should be traceable, so you can't just take revelation and say this is the answer. Fine. But you don't just take what a theorist says and says, a theorist says this, so this is the answer. No, you say, okay, a theorist says this and we don't understand any of it, but we're going to look and see if it works. And when they kind of line up, then you go, okay, we think we have an answer and this looks like science. If a prophet were to come and say, this is where God has shown me to shine my laser or grow my peanut, therefore, go away and do this experiment and see if it lines up. Is that out of place in science? Now, Christianity does not have the sole access to this kind of way of doing science. So Srinivasa Ramanujan was an Indian mathematician who worked with G.H. Hardy in Cambridge. And he came up with insane mathematical conjectures, absolutely crazy mathematical conjectures, and he couldn't prove them. Now, some of his conjectures turned out to be wrong. Some of his conjectures turned out to be right. Some of his conjectures turned out to be wrong, but were really, really interesting in trying to work out how to show they were right or how to show they were wrong or how to fix them. And while this inspiration came to him, and Hardy said, I don't know where this inspiration comes from, but it's worth having him around. It's worth working with him because these crazy conjectures that he cannot prove are really interesting to work on mathematically and really fruitful and drive the subject forward. Now, Ramanujan himself said he did know where this inspiration came from. They came to him in his sleep from Namagiri, his family goddess. Now, was a goddess revealing mathematics to him? Did he have a particularly fertile mind that just happened to come up with crazy mathematical formulae? I don't know. Was there some third option going on? I also don't know. And yet, Cambridge University said, wherever it's coming from, it's interesting enough that we're going to keep him round because this forms a reasonable part of mathematics research. So, in summary then, we have, I suggest, 3 ways of obtaining information: reason, observation, revelation. Now, we saw in the previous lecture, once we get this information, how to put it together. In the next lecture, we're going to look at whether or not the conclusions we put together should seem in any way, shape or form reliable.